Hey guys, Tim Walker from CoGri Group here, and today we're going to talk about one of the most common topics that I get asked about. I'm talking about steel fibers on the surface of floors. So what's going on? Why do some concrete floors have thousands of tiny little wires poking out of the surface? Steel fiber reinforcement is used in warehouses because it allows efficient designs and large joint-free panels. The trade-off is that you'll get some level of steel fibers on the surface. That's because the fibers go in the back of the concrete truck. They get mixed in with the concrete. They create this three-dimensional matrix. It reinforces the floor, but it does mean that there's hundreds of thousands of these little metal wires in every cubic meter of concrete. So it's almost impossible, some would say impossible, to 100% cover up all the fibers. So with that in mind, is it an issue? Most of the time it's not, but it does depend on what the floor is being used for. So I would never use steel fiber in a retail floor like a Bunnings or a Masters or a Costco, because some of those fibers on the surface could end up poking someone in a foot. Also, be careful about using steel fibers in situations where you might have something stored directly on the floor, like grain that's being fed to animals, in case one of the wires got loose and got scooped up and ended up in someone's food or in a cow's food. But generally, for a normal logistics warehouse, it's not been an issue. It's not a problem at all. We do get all sorts of issues raised, and most of the time, there's really nothing to them. So one of the examples is tenants talking about forklifts, tires being damaged. But it's not really because of the steel fibers. The steel fibers are very thin. They don't penetrate typical tire rubber easily. And we've just never ended up with an actual documented case where it turned out that the steel fibers were causing damage to the forklift tires. We do occasionally get asked about fibers punching through into someone's foot. I've talked about how I'm wary of that in a retail environment. But again, in a warehouse, people will typically be wearing safety footwear or at least sturdy closed footwear, just as a general health and safety measure. And the steel fibers won't get through. Corrosion of the fibers comes up from time to time. Sometimes you'll even see surface rust on some of the fibers, especially outside external slabs where it rains. But again, not really an issue. Fibers are not continuously connected to each other. There's gaps between them, so it's not like normal reinforcing. And the surface fiber rusting, other than it looking ugly and staining, it's not going to cause an issue. Like, it's not going to affect the structural integrity of the slab. So generally speaking, fibers on the surface just aren't an issue for a normal warehouse building. However, if you get a lot of steel fiber on the surface, like what we would consider a bad finish, we do see problems. Specifically, we see that the surface of the floors lose durability. They wear out faster than they should. Essentially, these floors need more maintenance than they should at an earlier age. It's also always an aesthetic issue, but when you get a lot of fibers on the surface, that issue's a lot worse. And that's probably what causes the headache for the property managers who get the calls from the unhappy tenants. So most of the time, not an issue, but if you have a bad finish with a lot of fiber, they do cause unintended consequences. So what is an acceptable level for steel fiber on the surface? Currently, the main or only published guidance that exists that talks about level of steel fibers on the surface and how you can test for it or survey it is a Belgium guideline, TV 204. And they talk about a good warehouse floor finish being less than 3 visible steel fibers per square meter and a reasonable finish being 3 to 6. The ACIFC, a UK organisation that represents flooring contractors, has suggested because the finishing of fibre floors is good, you don't really need a guideline like TV 204. And I think that brings up a really good point. The quality of finishing and the number of fibres on the surface are a very regional and contractor-specific issue. A lot of the floors in New Zealand over the last 3 to 5 years have had really poor finishes. They wouldn't be close to falling within those guidelines of 3 to 6 fibres per square metre. They'd probably be 20, 30, maybe even more. I think that variability between regions and contractors is in itself an argument for developers to specify a limit for steel fibre on the surface, like a TV204. And that's what we put in our specs at the moment in New Zealand. So what can you do to reduce steel fibres on the surface? It comes down to mix design and finishing technique. Or alternatively, you can go in a different direction and use a dry shape topping that will cover up the fibres. I don't typically recommend dry shape toppings. They add cost, they add complexity, and they increase the risk of delamination quite dramatically. With mix design, the theory would be to have higher fines content in the mix to increase that, to give more paste to cover up the fibre. The trade-off there is going to be that that will also move you towards a higher risk of delamination. So not necessarily something that you should do lightly. And I would note we have a lot of really poor surfaces in New Zealand that have lots of fibre on the surface and also have delamination in the same slabs. And those are projects that use concrete with what I would consider a very high fines content, which brings me to finishing. And I think this is probably the key part, especially with some of the projects in New Zealand where there's been a habit of contractors wanting to pour really large pours, multiple bays in a day, doing 3,000-4,000 squares. The other factor I'd note is that some fibres are harder to finish than others, particularly the thinner fibres, the 80-60. You get more fibres per kilogram, and they also seem to flick out more during finishing and other processes. We also see a worse result in terms of floor durability with the newer generation of high-performance fibres that have a higher tensile strength. I think what's generally happening there is you have a much stiffer wire, so when they are poking out of the surface, particularly lots of them, they don't snap or fold or break like fibres traditionally did. Instead, they either get pulled out and bring concrete with them, or they will just sort of stay in place and spring back and forth, and that just causes a bigger sprawl. So we've certainly seen much worse maintenance required on the floors that have been constructed with the higher tensile, higher performance, higher aspect ratio fibres. Once the floor's cast, what can you do to fix the issue? Well, if it's not too bad, you could go and individually clip out and patch the fibres. For the floors that are really bad with like lots and lots of fibres on the surface, like in some of these videos I've had playing, you probably need to think about doing a pump screed or an epoxy coating or something else to just completely reinstate the surface, because over time under traffic, you're just going to keep pulling out fibres and damaging the floor. Really not a good situation to be in.